Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. The year was 1973, and Sarah Mitchell stood on the cracked pavement of what used to be Glenrio's busiest intersection. She watched as another car zoomed past on the new Interstate 40, its taillights disappearing into the Texas horizon without so much as slowing down. Behind her, the Texaco station where she'd pumped gas for 20 years sat silent, its art moderne curves casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. The neon sign that once beckoned travellers still hung there, but the electricity had been cut off 3 months ago. She wasn't crying anymore. There were no tears left for what was already gone. Just 5 years earlier, this same corner had been alive with possibility. Cars would line up 6 deep, waiting for gas. The diner next door served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon because the rush never stopped. Children ran between the motel rooms while their parents stretched their legs and planned the next leg of their journey across America. The sound of laughter mixed with the rumble of engines and the constant ding of the service station bell. Everyone who stopped here was going somewhere, and Glenrio was the place that helped them get there. But now, the only sound was the wind pushing tumbleweeds across Highway 66, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that her town was dying. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the swift finality of a door slamming shut. What happened here wasn't unique. Across the American West, dozens of towns were experiencing the same quiet apocalypse. Some died in a matter of months, others took years, bleeding population until only the stubborn or the desperate remained. These weren't the ghost towns of legend, abandoned overnight when the gold ran out or the railroad moved on. These were modern American communities, with schools and swimming pools and Friday night football games. They had mortgages and main streets and dreams for the future, and then, one by one, those dreams turned to dust. The story of America's ghost towns in the 1960s and 1970s is not the story you think you know. It's not about Wild West shootouts or prospectors with pickaxes. It's about families who watched the world change faster than they could adapt. It's about government decisions made in Washington that destroyed communities 1,000 miles away. It's about men who mined uranium for their country and paid for it with their lungs. It's about the hidden cost of progress, and who gets left behind when the future moves on without you. Tonight, we're going to walk through these forgotten places together. We'll meet the people who refused to leave even when their neighbors did. We'll discover the secrets that mining companies never wanted you to know. We'll explore the moments when entire towns realized their time was up. And we'll uncover the truth about what it really meant to live in the American West during those 2 transformative decades when prosperity and abandonment existed, side by side, sometimes on the same street. Before the interstate highway system carved its efficient path across America, before uranium prices collapsed and steel mills went silent, these towns were thriving. Walk back with me to the 1950s, when the future seemed limitless, and every mining camp believed its boom would last forever. Route 66 stretched like a ribbon of possibility from Chicago to Los Angeles, and along its 2,400 miles, hundreds of small towns found their purpose serving America's great migration west. In the summer of 1955, a family driving from Missouri to California might stop at 40 different towns along the way. Each stop meant money spent on gas, food, lodging, souvenirs. The roadside economy wasn't just robust, it was the entire reason many of these communities existed. Glenrio had been smart about its location, straddling the state line between Texas and New Mexico. Gas was cheaper on the Texas side because of lower taxes, so the stations clustered there. But alcohol sales were legal in New Mexico and prohibited in dry Texas, so the bars and liquor stores all stood on the western side of town. Travelers would pull up, fill their tanks on one side of the street, then walk across to the diner on the other side for a beer with their burger. The town's geography had created a perfect economic ecosystem, but Glenrio was just one star in a constellation of Route 66 towns that seemed to have figured out the secret to permanent prosperity. Amboy, California, in the heart of the Mojave Desert, had Roy's Motel and Cafe with its magnificent neon sign that could be seen for miles across the flat desert landscape. The sign's retro-futuristic design spoke to post-war optimism, all swooping lines and brilliant colours. Roy's wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. Travellers crossing the Mojave needed water, needed rest, needed air conditioning, and Roy's provided all three. At the town's peak, hundreds of people stopped there every single day. The same families who had once struggled through the Depression were now taking road trips, buying new cars, exploring their country. And places like Amboy made that possible. Further east, Two Guns, Arizona, had turned itself into a tourist spectacle. The town sat above Canyon Diablo, where a massive bridge carried Route 66 over the chasm. Entrepreneurs had built gas stations, but they'd also added attractions that would make travelers stop longer and spend more money. There was a zoo featuring mountain lions and other animals. Trading posts sold Native American crafts, some authentic, some decidedly less so. The Apache Death Cave, with its dark history, had been turned into a tour stop. Two Guns understood that in the age of the automobile, entertainment was just as valuable as fuel. And then there was the uranium boom, which transformed the American Southwest in ways that Route 66 never could. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, the race was on to secure America's nuclear future. Uranium, once a relatively obscure element used mainly for coloring glass, suddenly became more valuable than gold. The Atomic Energy Commission needed uranium for bombs, for research, for the reactors that would power the nuclear submarines and the power plants of tomorrow. And the Four Corners region, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, turned out to be sitting on vast deposits of the stuff. Charlie Steen's 1952 uranium discovery near Moab, Utah, set off a frenzy. This wasn't the California gold rush of 1849, but it had the same manic energy. Men with Geiger counters fanned out across the Colorado Plateau, testing every promising sandstone formation. When someone found a hot spot, when that Geiger counter started clicking faster, claim stakes would go up and drilling would begin. If the core samples showed enough uranium, suddenly there was money to build a mine, hire workers, create a town. Grants, New Mexico, had been a quiet little community of 2,200 people when Paddy Martinez, a Navajo rancher, discovered uranium ore in 1950. Within months, the population exploded to 50,000. The town proclaimed itself the uranium capital of the world, and for a while, that wasn't just boastful talk. 5 processing mills operated in and around Grants, turning raw ore into yellow cake uranium oxide that glowed with that distinctive bright yellow color. The mills ran around the clock, and so did the mines. The Atomic Energy Commission had price guarantees in place, which meant that as long as you could produce uranium, you could sell it. There was no such thing as market risk, at least not in the short term. Jeffrey City, Wyoming, barely existed until the mines opened in 1957. The Western Nuclear Corporation and later Federal American partners built the town almost from scratch to house their workers. It wasn't a ramshackle mining camp with tents and temporary buildings. Jeffrey City had proper streets, modern houses, schools with new equipment. The mining companies, knowing they needed to attract skilled workers to this remote location, added amenities. There was a swimming pool built at the request of the miners' wives who knew that Wyoming summers could be brutal. There were tennis courts, there was a bowling alley. This wasn't frontier living, this was suburban comfort transplanted into the high desert of central Wyoming. Life in these boomtowns during the 1950s and early 1960s felt secure in a way that's hard to explain to people who didn't experience it. The work was hard, especially in the uranium mines, where the heat could exceed 100 degrees and the air was thick with rock dust. But the pay was good. The benefits were real. The community was tight-knit because everyone depended on the same industry, worked for the same companies, sent their kids to the same schools. Friday nights meant high school football games where the whole town turned out. Saturday mornings meant Little League games and grocery shopping. Sunday mornings were for church and Sunday afternoons were for family dinners. Eagle Mountain, California, exemplified this prosperity. Built to house workers at the massive iron ore mine owned by Kaiser Steel, the town reached its peak population of about 4,000 in the 1970s. 1,500 of those residents worked directly at the mine, extracting the ore that would be shipped to Kaiser's steel mills in Fontana. Eagle Mountain had everything a small community needed. There was a recreation hall that hosted New Year's Eve parties, Halloween celebrations, community dances. There was an ice cream truck that rolled through the streets daily, blasting Elvis songs from its speakers. Parents didn't worry about crime because there essentially wasn't any. Everyone knew everyone else, and that social cohesion created safety. Leadville, Colorado sat high in the Rocky Mountains at an altitude that made newcomers gasp for breath. But if you could handle the thin air, if you could adapt to the reality that you were working at over 10,000 feet above sea level, then Leadville offered something special. The Climax mine, perched at timberline atop Fremont Pass, was the world's largest producer of molybdenum, a mineral that became crucial for hardening steel. The mine operated continuously, 3 shifts around the clock every single day. AMAX, the company that owned Climax, employed 3,000 people directly and countless others indirectly through the businesses that supplied the mine and served the miners. The pay at Climax was extraordinary for the time. $12 an hour in the early 1970s was serious money. With overtime, benefits, and steady work, a Climax miner could make the equivalent of $80,000 a year in today's terms. Every other Friday was payday, and by mid-morning, a crowd of wives and girlfriends would gather at the post office in Leadville, waiting for the envelopes containing those precious checks to arrive. By noon, the town's businesses would be packed with miners and their families, spending that money on groceries, clothes, furniture, cars, whatever they needed or wanted. The Golden Burrow Cafe on Harrison Avenue was the social center of mining life. When the shifts changed, miners would flood in for coffee and breakfast or beer and conversation. The talk was always about the mine, about production numbers, about who was moving up to better positions, about whether the union would strike for better benefits. This was the golden age these towns remember. This was the prosperity that made people believe their communities would last forever. Children born in these places in the 1950s grew up assuming they'd raise their own children there, that the mines and the highways and the mills would always need workers. That progress meant growth, and growth meant security. But underneath all that confidence, there were warning signs that almost no one wanted to see. The Interstate Highway Act had passed in 1956, and while it promised to make travel faster and more efficient, what did that mean for the little towns whose entire existence depended on travelers stopping? When you didn't have to drive through every small town between here and there, when you could bypass them at 70 miles per hour, why would you stop? The engineers and planners in Washington understood this trade-off. Local business owners mostly didn't, or they refused to believe it would really happen to their town. And in the uranium mines, men were getting sick. Not right away, not in obvious ways, but slowly. Persistent coughs that wouldn't go away. Shortness of breath that kept getting worse. Doctors in Moab and Grants and Jeffrey City were starting to see patterns, but the mining companies and the Atomic Energy Commission maintained that everything was fine. The mines were safe. The exposure levels were acceptable. Keep working. Keep producing. Your country needs this uranium. The false security of the boom years rested on assumptions that were already starting to crack. But in Leadville and Glenrio, in Jeffrey City and Eagle Mountain, in all those towns that had hitched their futures to a single industry or a single highway, people went about their lives believing that tomorrow would look pretty much like today. They had no idea how wrong they were. The story of Jeffrey City's uranium boom and the cold silence that followed tells you everything you need to know about how prosperity can become poison without anyone noticing, until it's far too late. This wasn't a ghost town from the Old West. This was a modern American community built on promises that the government and the mining companies made but never really intended to keep. When Western Nuclear and Federal American partners recruited workers to Jeffrey City in the late 1950s, they sold a vision of patriotic prosperity. You weren't just taking a mining job, you were serving your country in the Cold War. Every pound of uranium you extracted from the ground was a pound that would go into America's nuclear arsenal or its peaceful reactors. You were on the front lines of freedom, and you'd be compensated accordingly. The companies built nice houses, modern schools, recreational facilities. They wanted workers to bring their families, to put down roots, to commit to this place for the long term, because mining wasn't a short-term project. The work itself was brutal in ways that took years to understand. Uranium ore doesn't just sit on the surface waiting to be collected. It's embedded deep in sandstone, in veins that twist and turn through solid rock. Miners would drill holes, pack them with explosives, blast away sections of rock, then go in with machinery to haul out the rubble. The temperature underground often exceeded 100 degrees. The humidity was oppressive. The rock dust hung in the air so thick that headlamp beams became almost solid columns of light, piercing the murk. And that dust contained not just silica, which was bad enough for lungs, but also uranium and its radioactive decay products, including radon gas. The Atomic Energy Commission knew about the health risks. Government scientists had known since the 1940s that uranium miners in Europe had been dying of lung cancer at alarming rates for centuries. The Erz Mountains on the border between Germany and what's now the Czech Republic had been mined for radium and uranium since the 1500s, and medical records from as early as the 16th century documented high rates of what they called mountain sickness among the miners, a wasting disease that we now know was radiation-induced lung cancer. By the time the AEC was recruiting American men to mine uranium in the Southwest, the science was settled. Chronic exposure to radon and uranium dust would cause cancer, but nobody told the miners, and nobody required the mining companies to install ventilation systems that would have made the underground environment safer. The technology existed, the solutions were known, but ventilation systems cost money, and they slowed production, and the AEC's priority was getting as much uranium out of the ground as quickly as possible. The Cold War arms race didn't pause for safety regulations. So men went into those mines breathing air that was slowly killing them, and they had no idea. Life in Jeffrey City during the boom years felt like the American dream achieved. The town had everything a family could want. The schools were new and well-equipped. The community center hosted movie nights and dances. The swimming pool was Olympic-sized, maintained beautifully because the mining companies understood that amenities like this helped attract and retain workers in such a remote location. Women who married uranium miners found themselves living in a genuine community, not some crude camp in the middle of nowhere. There were book clubs and church groups and youth sports leagues. Children growing up in Jeffrey City in the 1960s had childhoods that looked a lot like childhoods anywhere else in America, except their fathers came home from work with a strange yellowish dust on their clothes and a cough that never quite went away. Grants, New Mexico, experienced this same uranium-fueled prosperity at an even larger scale. The town had been modest before Paddy Martinez's 1950 discovery, known mainly as the carrot capital of the world because of the agricultural region nearby. But uranium changed everything. The population explosion from 2,200 to 50,000 happened so fast that housing couldn't keep up. People lived in trailers, in temporary quarters, in whatever they could find. The infrastructure strained under the sudden weight of all these new residents, but there was money everywhere. 37 uranium mines operated in the area at the peak, along with 5 processing mills. The mills took the raw ore that the mines produced and refined it into yellowcake, that bright yellow uranium oxide powder that would then be shipped to weapons facilities or reactor sites. The entire industrial ecosystem hummed with activity. The Uranium Cafe on Grant's main drag became a symbol of the town's identity. Miners would stop there before shifts, after shifts, during shift changes. The coffee was strong, the food was cheap, and everyone knew everyone else. Conversations revolved around which mines were hiring, which ones had hit rich veins, which operations were expanding. There was a sense that Grant's had found its permanent place in the American economy. Uranium wasn't like gold or silver, minerals that depended on speculation and jewelry demand. Uranium was strategic. As long as America needed nuclear weapons and nuclear power, the demand would be there. Or so everyone thought. Moab at Utah followed a similar trajectory after Charlie Steen's discovery. The population grew from 1,200 to 6,500 in just a few years. Steen himself became fabulously wealthy almost overnight, building a mansion on a hillside overlooking the town, a constant reminder to every other prospector that fortunes were still being made in the American West if you had the luck and persistence to find them. The uranium rush brought people from all over the country, some with mining experience, but many without. If you had a strong back and didn't mind hard work, you could find employment. The Uranium Reduction Company mill that Steen opened in 1957 operated continuously, processing ore into yellow cake. In 1962, Floyd Odlum's Atlas Corporation bought the facility, a sign that the big money was moving in, that uranium had graduated from frontier prospecting to corporate industrial operation. But by the mid-1970s, the cracks were starting to show. The nuclear arms race had plateaued. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had built arsenals that could destroy the world several times over. The urgency to produce ever more uranium had diminished. Commercial nuclear power plants were being built, but not at the breakneck pace that the industry had predicted in the 1960s. Public opinion about nuclear energy was shifting. Environmental concerns about radiation, about waste disposal, about the risks of accidents were growing louder. And then came 3 Mile Island. On March 28, 1979, the nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania suffered a partial meltdown. The accident released radioactive gases into the atmosphere. Pregnant women and young children were evacuated from the area. The world watched as American nuclear engineers struggled to contain a situation that had spiraled out of control. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island, not directly, but the psychological impact was enormous. If a modern American nuclear plant, operated by trained professionals with all the safety systems and regulations in place, could still have a catastrophic failure, what did that say about the future of nuclear energy? The answer, as far as the uranium industry was concerned, was devastating. Uranium prices, which had been declining gradually through the 1970s as demand softened, now collapsed. The Atomic Energy Commission's price guarantees had ended years earlier. Mines that had been marginally profitable now couldn't cover their operating costs. Companies began shutting down operations. By the early 1980s, the boom was definitively over. Jeffrey City's population had peaked at around 5,000 people. By 1988, fewer than 50 remained. The exodus happened fast. When the mines closed, there was no other reason to stay. The jobs were gone, the paychecks stopped, families packed up and left, often within weeks of the closure announcements. Houses stood empty. The swimming pool that had been the pride of the community was drained and left a crack in the Wyoming wind. The schools closed, the stores closed, the community center fell silent, and the men who had spent 20 or 30 years breathing uranium dust started dying. The lung cancer rates among uranium miners in the Four Corners region turned out to be staggering. Studies eventually showed that these men were dying of lung cancer at rates 5 times higher than the general population, in some cases even higher. The latency period for radiation-induced cancer is long, often decades, which meant that many miners didn't get sick until the 1980s and 1990s, long after they'd left the industry. They'd moved on to other jobs, other towns, other lives. And then the cough would start, the shortness of breath, the weight loss, the diagnosis that told them they had months to live. In 1989, after years of legal battles and denial, Congress finally passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which provided financial compensation to uranium miners who had developed cancer as a result of their work. But by then, hundreds were already dead. The compensation couldn't bring them back. It couldn't give their children back their fathers. It couldn't restore the communities that had been built on the promise of safe, secure employment. Grants, New Mexico, watched its uranium boom die the same death. By 1985, the Uranium Cafe had closed, its windows boarded up. The 37 mines had dwindled to a handful, then to none. The population crashed. The town tried to pivot back to its agricultural roots, tried to market itself as a tourist destination. But who wants to visit a dying mining town? Some residents held on, hoping the industry would come back. Mining companies would occasionally announce plans to reopen operations when uranium prices ticked up, and for a brief moment, hope would flicker back to life. But it never lasted. The fundamental equation had changed. Nuclear power's promise of cheap, clean energy had been exposed as more complicated and more dangerous than anyone had wanted to admit. The uranium boomtowns had been built on a foundation of government need and corporate profit, with a layer of patriotic rhetoric on top to make it all seem noble. Serve your country, power the future, be part of the atomic age. But the men who actually did that work, who went into those hot, dusty mines and extracted the uranium that went into bombs and reactors, paid for it with their health and their lives. And when the industry moved on, when uranium was no longer needed in such vast quantities, the communities built around that extraction were simply abandoned. The ghost towns of the uranium boom stand as monuments to a particularly American form of betrayal. We promised prosperity, we promised security, we promised that hard work in service of national interest would be rewarded. And for a while, we kept those promises. But only for a while. When the cost of keeping them became inconvenient, when the uranium wasn't needed anymore, the promises evaporated like morning fog in the desert sun. And the people who believed those promises were left to figure out what comes after the boom ends, when the thing you built your entire life around simply doesn't exist anymore. While the uranium towns were grappling with radiation and broken promises, another wave of death was spreading across the American West, this one driven not by geology or chemistry, but by the simple logic of efficient transportation. The interstate highway system, conceived as a triumph of American engineering and progress, became the death sentence for dozens of towns along Route 66. The Interstate Highway Act that President Eisenhower signed in 1956 authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of divided highways connecting every major city in America. The system was sold on multiple merits: national defense, economic efficiency, modernization. In case of nuclear war or invasion, the military needed to be able to move troops and equipment quickly across the country. Businesses needed faster shipping, commuters wanted shorter travel times. The old two-lane highways that wound through every small town, with traffic lights and speed limits and local traffic mixing with through traffic, were seen as hopelessly outdated. But nobody ever seriously calculated what this modernization would cost the small towns that existed only because of those older highways. Or rather, somebody probably did calculate it and decided the cost was acceptable. Progress always has casualties. Glenrio learned this lesson the hard way. The town's entire existence had been predicated on its location on Route 66. Travelers had to drive through Glenrio. There was no alternate route. If you wanted to go west, you stopped for gas. You stopped for a meal. You stopped for the night. The businesses on Glenrio's main street, such as it was, had been built on the absolute certainty of through traffic. The town wasn't big enough or strategically located enough to have any other economic reason to exist. It was a service stop, nothing more and nothing less. But that had been enough for decades. When Interstate 40 was completed through this section in the early 1970s, the new highway bypassed Glenrio completely. Drivers heading west from Amarillo or east from Albuquerque would see the exit signs for Glenrio, but there was no reason to take the exit. The interstate had gas stations and rest areas. If you needed food, you'd wait until you reached Tucumcari or some other larger town, with restaurants visible from the highway. Glenrio became irrelevant, not gradually, but almost instantly. Mary Johnson had run the diner in Glenrio since 1952. Her apple pie had been famous among truckers who regularly drove Route 66. She'd memorized the preferences of her regular customers, knew how they liked their coffee, remembered their kids' names. The diner had been more than a business. It had been a community gathering place, the spot where locals and travelers mixed. On a busy summer day in the 1960s, the diner might serve 300 people. The counter would be full, every booth occupied, the kitchen producing an endless stream of burgers and eggs and pie. The cash register rang constantly, and at the end of each week Mary would deposit enough money to cover her expenses and still have plenty left over. The week after Interstate 40 opened, 14 people came to the diner. The next week, 9. Mary watched the traffic stream past on the new highway half a mile away, cars and trucks moving at 70 miles per hour, never slowing, never stopping. She kept the diner open for 6 more months, partly out of stubbornness and partly because she couldn't quite accept that it was really over. She'd spent 20 years building this business. But running a restaurant with almost no customers is financial suicide. The food spoiled because she couldn't sell it fast enough. The suppliers stopped delivering because she couldn't pay the bills. In early 1974, Mary locked the door for the last time and moved to Amarillo. The gas station where Sarah Mitchell had worked closed around the same time. The motel held on a bit longer, trying to market itself to people who preferred the charm of old Route 66 to the sterility of interstate travel. But charm doesn't pay the electric bill. By 1975, Glenrio had a population of 0, though technically it has never been officially disincorporated. The buildings still stand, many of them remarkably well preserved because the dry desert air doesn't rot wood the way humidity would. The Texaco station, with its art moderne styling, looks almost exactly as it did in its final days of operation. The motel's rooms, empty and silent, still have beds and furniture inside. It's a town frozen at the moment of death. Glenrio's fate was repeated dozens of times across the Southwest and Midwest, as Interstate 40 and other highways carved their efficient paths across America. Amboy, California, suffered the same collapse when the new interstate bypassed it. Roy's Motel and Cafe, with its magnificent neon sign, kept operating for a while through sheer determination. The owner, Roy Crowell, believed that enough people valued the Route 66 experience to keep stopping. He was wrong. The population of Amboy had been several hundred at its peak. By the time Interstate 40 opened, it was maybe a couple dozen. Within years, it was less than 10. The motel stayed open intermittently, depending on whether anyone could make a go of it. The cafe served food when someone could afford to keep it stocked, but mostly Amboy became a curiosity, something you might stop to photograph if you happened to be on old Route 66, but not a place where any business could survive. Two Guns, Arizona, met an even more dramatic end. The town had never been particularly large, but its tourist attractions had made it profitable. When the interstate opened and the traffic disappeared, the businesses closed rapidly. The zoo shut down, the animals sold off or released. The trading posts locked their doors. The buildings, already showing their age, began to deteriorate without maintenance. In the early 1970s, a fire swept through part of the town, destroying several structures. Nobody bothered to rebuild. The ruins of Two Guns now stand as a particularly photogenic ghost town, popular with photographers who want dramatic images of American decay. The old zoo cages, empty and rusting, the burned-out buildings with their windows gaping like eye sockets, the general sense of abandonment and loss. It all makes for compelling photographs, but terrible living conditions. The human cost of these closures is hard to quantify. When Mary Johnson moved to Amarillo, she was in her 60s and starting over. The equity she'd built up in her diner evaporated. The building was worth virtually nothing once the traffic disappeared. She'd spent 2 decades of her life building a business that ultimately became worthless, not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she'd failed to adapt or failed to serve good food, but because the federal government decided to build a highway somewhere else. That loss, that sense of betrayal, marked her for the rest of her life. She'd done everything right according to the rules of the game as they existed when she started, and then someone changed the rules without asking her permission. Multiply Mary's story by thousands, and you begin to understand what the interstate highway system cost the people who lived along Route 66. Every diner owner, every motel operator, every gas station attendant, every store clerk whose income depended on through traffic experienced some version of the same shock. The work they'd been doing, the businesses they'd built, the communities they'd created, all of it became instantly obsolete. The lucky ones got out early, selling their businesses before the full impact of the interstate became clear. The unlucky ones held on until their savings were exhausted, and they had no choice but to walk away, from buildings they still owned but could no longer afford to maintain. Some towns tried to fight back. They lobbied state and federal officials to route the interstate closer to their towns, to provide convenient access, to preserve at least some of the through traffic. Occasionally, these efforts succeeded. Tucumcari, New Mexico, managed to get its interstate exit located close enough to the town's business district that motels and restaurants could advertise to interstate travelers and actually get some of them to stop. But most towns weren't large enough or politically connected enough to influence the routing decisions. The engineers built the interstate where engineering considerations dictated, which usually meant the flattest, straightest route, not the route that would preserve existing communities. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Route 66 itself had done the same thing to an earlier generation of towns. Before the highway was built in the 1920s, different routes connected Chicago and Los Angeles. Older roads, often following trails that dated back to Native American trade routes, passed through different towns. When Route 66 was designated and paved, it bypassed many of those older communities, just as Interstate 40 would later bypass Route 66 towns. The cycle of boom and abandonment has repeated itself across the American West for more than a century. A new transportation route opens. Towns spring up to serve it. The route becomes obsolete. The towns die. It's as American as anything else about our history. But understanding that broader pattern doesn't make it any less devastating for the individual people who live through it. For Sarah Mitchell, standing on that empty corner in Glenrio in 1973, watching the traffic stream past her dying town, the historical cycles were irrelevant. What mattered was that her world was ending, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The Route 66 ghost towns represent a different kind of abandonment than the uranium mining towns. The uranium miners at least got sick doing work that seemed necessary, serving what they believed was the national interest. The Route 66 business owners got crushed simply because a new technology made their locations inconvenient. They weren't even important enough to be poisoned. They were just in the way. Eagle Mountain, California seemed like the most stable place in the world until the moment it wasn't. Unlike the Route 66 towns that died overnight, when traffic patterns shifted, Eagle Mountain's death was slower, more deliberate, and perhaps more cruel because residents could see it coming, but couldn't stop it. The Kaiser Steel Corporation had built Eagle Mountain in the late 1940s to house workers at its massive iron ore mine. The location was about as remote as you could get in Southern California, 100 miles from the nearest city, surrounded by desert and mountains. But the iron ore deposit was enormous, high-quality ore that could be extracted and shipped to Kaiser's steel mills in Fontana. The company needed workers willing to live in this isolated location, so it built not just a mining camp, but a genuine town. By the 1970s, Eagle Mountain had reached its peak population of around 4,000 people, with 1,500 working directly at the mine and the rest working in supporting roles or as family members. Life in Eagle Mountain during the boom years had a strange quality of isolation mixed with community. You couldn't just drive to the store on a whim. The nearest significant shopping was an hour away. But within the town itself, everything you needed was there. The company provided a commissary that sold groceries and household goods. There was a recreation hall for social events. The town had schools, a medical clinic, all the basics of modern life. Because everyone worked for Kaiser in some capacity, either directly or through businesses that served the mining operation, there was an unusual degree of economic equality. Nobody was wealthy, but nobody was poor either. The pay was good, the benefits were solid, and the cost of living was low. Children growing up in Eagle Mountain in the 1960s and 1970s had an idyllic existence in many ways. The town was safe enough that kids could roam freely without parents worrying. The recreation hall hosted frequent events tailored to families, Halloween parties with elaborate decorations, New Year's Eve celebrations that the whole community attended, summer barbecues, Christmas parties where Kaiser would provide gifts for all the children. There was an ice cream truck that made daily rounds, its speakers blasting Elvis and other rock and roll classics. Kids would hear those songs from blocks away and come running with their change, lining up for their cones and popsicles. The sense of permanence was strong. Kaiser was one of the largest industrial corporations in America. The steel industry seemed rock solid, literally and figuratively. The mine had been operating for decades and showed no signs of running out of ore. Parents assumed their children would grow up, work at the mine themselves or marry someone who did, and raise their own families in Eagle Mountain. That's how company towns worked when they worked well, creating multi-generational stability. But the 1970s brought changes that would prove catastrophic for steel production. The global recession triggered by the 1973 oil crisis hit manufacturers hard. Demand for steel dropped sharply. At the same time, foreign steel producers, particularly in Japan and later Korea, began competing aggressively in the American market with lower prices. The American steel industry, which had dominated globally for decades, suddenly found itself under severe pressure. Profit margins tightened, then disappeared entirely for many operations. Kaiser Steel's problems extended beyond just market conditions. The company's integrated steel mills in Fontana were aging. Newer mills being built by competitors used more efficient technology. Kaiser faced a choice: invest billions in modernizing its facilities or scale back operations. The company chose the latter. Through the mid and late 1970s, Kaiser began cutting production. The iron ore mine at Eagle Mountain, which had seemed so secure, began to look like a vulnerability rather than an asset. The ore was high quality, but the remote location meant high transportation costs. If you could buy ore more cheaply from other sources, even if it was slightly lower quality, the economics worked out better. In 1981, Kaiser announced that it would begin phasing out the Eagle Mountain mine. The company framed it carefully, emphasizing that this was a gradual process, that workers would be given advance notice, that severance packages would be provided. But for the residents of Eagle Mountain, the message was clear. The town's reason for existing was ending. The reaction was shock mixed with a kind of numb disbelief. How could this happen? The mine still had ore. The town still functioned. Yes, the steel industry was struggling, but surely things would improve. Surely Kaiser wouldn't just abandon a facility where it had invested so much. Families held community meetings trying to figure out options. Could they convince Kaiser to reverse the decision? Could they find another company to take over the mine? Could the town somehow survive without the mine? The answer to all those questions was no. Kaiser's decision was final. By 1983, the mine had closed completely. The last load of iron ore was shipped out. The machinery fell silent. And then the town began to empty. Eagle Mountain's evacuation happened in stages. Workers with the most seniority, who qualified for the best severance packages, often left first, moving to other Kaiser facilities or finding jobs in other industries. Younger workers, who had invested less time in the company and had fewer options, sometimes stayed longer, hoping something would change. Families with school-age children faced terrible choices. Do you pull your kids out mid-year and move somewhere else? Do you finish the school year in a town that's dying around you? Do you wait until summer to leave, knowing that every month you stay is a month without income? The community infrastructure collapsed rapidly. The grocery store closed because there weren't enough customers. The post office shut down. Eagle Mountain's zip code was retired. The schools closed when enrollment dropped below viable levels. Families who wanted to stay found that staying became practically impossible. Where would you buy food? How would your children go to school? What would you do for medical care? The remote location that had once been manageable because the company provided everything became untenable without that support structure. By 1985, Eagle Mountain was effectively abandoned. A few die-hard residents remained, people who either couldn't afford to leave or refused to on principle, but the town was dead. Houses stood empty, windows broken by vandals or by the simple effects of weather and time. The recreation hall where families had celebrated so many holidays was locked and silent. The swimming pool cracked and filled with debris. The playgrounds rusted. One former resident, interviewed years later, captured the tragedy perfectly. We didn't run out of ore. We ran out of customers. The town had done nothing wrong. The workers had done nothing wrong. The iron ore was still there, still extractable, still usable. But global economic forces beyond anyone's control had made continuing unprofitable, and so everything stopped. The psychological impact of Eagle Mountain's closure was profound for those who experienced it. These weren't people who had made bad choices or failed to prepare for the future. They were people who had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They'd gotten stable jobs with a major corporation. They'd bought homes, they'd raised families, they'd invested in their community, and then, through no fault of their own, all of that was taken away. Not gradually, not with much warning, but with the brutal finality of an accounting department deciding that maintaining Eagle Mountain no longer made financial sense. Eagle Mountain's story was playing out simultaneously in mining communities across the American West. Leadville, Colorado, experienced the same slow-motion collapse when molybdenum prices crashed in the early 1980s. The Climax mine, which had operated continuously since 1919 and had seemed absolutely permanent, shut down. 3,000 workers lost their jobs almost overnight. The town's population, which had been stable for decades, plummeted. Businesses along Harrison Avenue closed. The Golden Burrow Cafe, that social centre where miners had gathered for generations, shut its doors. Houses that had been worth decent money became worthless because nobody wanted to move to a town with no jobs. The bitter irony of Leadville's situation was that the molybdenum was still there, just like the iron ore at Eagle Mountain was still there. The mine hadn't been exhausted. The closure wasn't about running out of resources. It was about market prices dropping below the cost of extraction. In theory, if prices rose again, the mine could reopen. But that's cold comfort when you need a paycheck today, when your mortgage is due and your kids need to eat. Economic theory doesn't put food on the table. What makes these closures particularly devastating is how completely they destroyed the social fabric of these communities. Eagle Mountain wasn't just a place to work. It was where friendships formed, where people met their spouses, where children played together and formed bonds that would have lasted a lifetime. When the town emptied, all of that was torn apart. Families scattered across California and beyond, trying to find work wherever they could. The kid you'd grown up with, your best friend who you'd assumed would be in your life forever, was suddenly living in another state. The neighbor who'd helped you fix your car, who you'd helped build a deck, was gone. The sense of community that had made life in a remote desert mining town bearable had evaporated. In the decades since Eagle Mountain closed, there have been various proposals to revive the site. A company wanted to turn it into a massive landfill, accepting trash from Los Angeles and using the old mine pit as the dump site. Environmental concerns and local opposition killed that plan. More recently, there have been proposals to turn Eagle Mountain into a renewable energy hub, with solar panels covering the desert flats. These plans haven't materialized either. The town remains abandoned, a monument to the boom and bust cycle that has defined so much of the American West's history. Walking through Eagle Mountain today, if you can get access to the site, is an eerie experience. Houses still stand, their exteriors weathered but recognizable. The recreation hall where thousands of parties and dances took place is still there, though you can't safely go inside anymore. The streets still have names, though the signs are faded and broken. It looks like a town where everyone just vanished suddenly, which in a sense is exactly what happened. The physical infrastructure remained after the community died, because there was no reason to demolish it and no economic value in salvaging it. So it sits there in the desert, slowly deteriorating, a ghost town from the 1980s that looks startlingly modern compared to the Wild West ghost towns of popular imagination. For the people who lived there during the boom years, Eagle Mountain represents not just a lost town, but a lost world. It was a place where hard work guaranteed security, where companies took care of their workers, where communities formed and endured. The fact that none of those things were really true, that the security was always contingent and temporary, doesn't change how it felt while it lasted. And when it ended, when Eagle Mountain died, not because of anything its residents did, but because of forces completely beyond their control, it shattered the implicit contract that had sustained these mining communities. You do the work, you keep your head down, you play by the rules, and you'll be taken care of. Eagle Mountain proved that promise was always a lie. The last residents of dying towns occupy a strange psychological space between denial and acceptance, stubbornness and despair. Their stories reveal the complicated relationship people develop with places, and how hard it can be to leave even when every rational consideration says you should go. Kenilworth, Utah, had been a coal mining town since the early 1900s, one of dozens in Carbon County that extracted the coal that powered America's industrialization. By the 1960s, the mines were starting to close. Some had been exhausted, the easy coal removed, and what remained too difficult or expensive to extract profitably. Others fell victim to changing economics as oil and natural gas became cheaper alternatives for power generation and industrial use. The consolidation of the coal industry meant smaller operations got absorbed or shut down entirely. When the Kenilworth mine closed, it put the entire town's existence in question. Unlike Eagle Mountain, which had been built and owned by the mining company, Kenilworth had been a company town initially, but had evolved beyond that. For decades, workers had rented their homes from the mine operators, but they'd never been able to buy them. The houses weren't theirs. The land wasn't theirs. If the company decided to shut everything down and demolish the town, which had happened in other places. The residents would be evicted with nowhere to go. But something unusual happened in Kenilworth. The mine owners, perhaps feeling some vestigial sense of responsibility, perhaps just wanting to avoid the hassle of demolition, offered to sell the houses to the residents. The price was around $600 per house, an absurdly low price even by 1960s standards, reflecting the fact that these houses had zero market value. Who would buy a house in a town with no jobs, no economy, no future? But for the residents who had lived there for years or decades, who had raised families in these houses, $600 was a chance to own something. Many residents scraped together the money and bought their homes. It gave them a sense of security they'd never had before. For the first time, they couldn't be evicted. The house was theirs, even if everything else was falling apart around them. Later, the mine operators also sold off parcels of land, allowing residents to actually own the ground their houses sat on. Finally, people felt safe, or at least safer than they'd been. But owning your house doesn't solve the problem of no jobs. Kenilworth's population began to drain away as working-age people left to find employment elsewhere. Some families stayed because they had deep roots in the community and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Others stayed because they couldn't afford to leave. Moving costs money, and establishing yourself in a new place is expensive. The oldest residents aged in place, sometimes literally until they died. The town faced a crisis when the utility companies that had provided water and power indicated they might stop service. Maintaining infrastructure for a shrinking customer base becomes economically unviable. Without water and electricity, Kenilworth would become completely uninhabitable. The remaining residents called a community meeting, one of those gatherings that small towns are famous for, where everyone shows up because everyone has a stake in the outcome. They decided to form their own utility company, selling shares to residents to raise capital, managing the water and power systems themselves as a cooperative. It was an act of defiant self-sufficiency, a refusal to let their town die completely. Decades later, Kenilworth still exists, though barely. A few dozen people live there, mostly retirees or people who work elsewhere, but prefer to live in Kenilworth's quiet isolation. The old company store sits abandoned, a hulking empty building on the main street. Occasionally someone drives up to check their mail at the row of mailboxes across from the store, but otherwise the street is empty. No one jogs by, no one walks a dog. The silence is profound. One former resident, when asked about leaving Kenilworth after the mines closed, said something revealing. When it finally came time to move, when her husband had found work in Montana and was already there, she realized she didn't want to go. She'd spent years longing to escape the isolation and limited opportunities of a small coal town, but when faced with actually leaving, she fell apart. She made her husband come back home rather than move without her. There's an attachment to place that runs deeper than rational calculation, something about the landscapes we know and the communities we're part of that becomes essential to our sense of self. This phenomenon repeated itself in town after town. People stayed long after any objective observer would say they should leave. Sometimes they stayed out of hope that things would turn around, that a new mine would open or a new industry would come in. Sometimes they stayed because the alternative, starting over somewhere unfamiliar, seemed more frightening than staying in a dying place. And sometimes they stayed simply because this was home, and home isn't something you abandon easily. In Grants, New Mexico, after the uranium mines closed, a hardcore group of residents remained even as the population plummeted from its peak of 50,000 back toward pre-boom levels. These weren't people with other options. Many were older, retired miners, living on pensions that, while they lasted, gave them enough to survive. Others were people whose skills were specific to mining and who couldn't easily transfer to other industries. What's a uranium miner supposed to do for work in a service economy? The education system in these boomtowns hadn't necessarily prepared people for knowledge work or professional careers. If the mine was the only good job you'd ever had, if that was the work you knew and were good at, what do you do when the mines close? Some residents of Grants held on to hopes that the uranium industry would come back, and occasionally it seemed like it might. When uranium prices would tick up based on renewed interest in nuclear power or changes in the global market, mining companies would make announcements about potentially reopening operations. There would be feasibility studies and geological surveys and community meetings where company representatives would talk in optimistic terms about the future. For a few months, the town would buzz with renewed energy. People who had been about to give up and leave would decide to wait just a bit longer. But these revivals always fell through. The economics never quite worked out. The regulatory environment had changed too much. Whatever the reason, the mines stayed closed, and after each false start, the town sank a little deeper into resignation. The Uranium Café, boarded up and silent, became a symbol of everything Grants had lost. It had been more than just a restaurant. It had been the town's living room, the place where the community gathered and reinforced its identity. Now it was just another empty building on a street full of empty buildings. Former residents driving through town decades later would see that boarded-up cafe and feel a wave of loss for a world that no longer existed. Leadville, Colorado, followed a similar pattern after the Climax mine shut down. The town's population dropped from several thousand to a few hundred. Those who remained were often retirees who had worked at Climax for decades and had nowhere else to go, or they were people who had invested so much in Leadville that leaving would mean total financial loss. Houses that had been worth $30,000 or $40,000 in the 1970s could barely be sold for $10,000 in the 1980s, if they could be sold at all. Property values in a town with no jobs and no prospects crater because nobody wants to buy there. If you owned your house outright, you could stay and at least have shelter, but if you still had a mortgage, you were trapped. You couldn't sell the house for enough to pay off what you owed, which meant you couldn't move without walking away from your debt and destroying your credit. The emotional toll of watching your town die slowly is perhaps worse than experiencing a sudden catastrophe. If a tornado destroys a town, there's shock and grief, but also clarity. The event is external and arbitrary. Nobody blames themselves. But when a town dies because of economic forces, because of decisions made by distant corporations and government officials, there's a persistent sense that maybe something could have been done differently, that if people had fought harder or been smarter, or seen it coming sooner, the outcome might have been different. That kind of ongoing ambiguity is psychologically corrosive. Children who grew up in these dying towns and then moved away often carried complicated feelings about their hometowns for the rest of their lives. Nostalgia for the good years, mixed with sadness and sometimes anger about what was lost. Reunions would happen occasionally, groups of former residents gathering to share memories and catch up on each other's lives. Facebook groups formed where people posted old photographs and told stories about teachers everyone remembered, or local characters who had been part of the town's fabric. These attempts to preserve memory were important, but also poignant, because they highlighted how completely the physical communities had dissolved. The people scattered to a dozen different states could never reassemble the closeness they'd once had. The last residents of dying towns are witnesses to a particular kind of American tragedy. They're the people who stayed loyal to places that couldn't stay loyal to them, not because places have loyalty, but because the economic systems that sustain those places were always temporary and always conditional. Their stubbornness, their refusal to acknowledge that their towns were dead, even when all the evidence pointed that direction, looks foolish from the outside. But from the inside, it makes perfect sense. Where else were they supposed to go? What else were they supposed to do? These were the towns they'd built, the communities they'd belonged to, the places where their lives had meaning. Leaving meant admitting defeat, admitting that all those years had been for nothing, that the promises had been empty. So they stayed, maintaining their houses, keeping the utilities running, forming their little cooperative companies to preserve some scrap of the communities that had once thrived. And eventually, one by one, they died, or finally left, and the towns became truly abandoned, not just economically dead, but physically empty, ghost towns in the most literal sense. The frontier violence of the Old West was supposed to have ended by the 20th century, tamed by sheriffs and courts and civilization. But in the dying towns of the American West during the 1960s and 1970s, a different kind of violence emerged, born not of lawlessness but of desperation, greed, and the collapse of social order. Ruby, Arizona had always been a rough place. Founded in the early 1900s when gold, silver, and zinc were discovered in the hills near the Mexican border, It attracted the kind of people who are willing to work in dangerous conditions in remote locations for the promise of good pay. At its peak, maybe 1,000 people lived there, served by a general store, a school, and a handful of other businesses. The mines themselves were the usual chaotic mix of tunnels and shafts, constantly expanding as miners followed the ore veins deeper into the earth. But Ruby's reputation wasn't built on its ore production. It was built on a series of murders that shocked even people familiar with rough mining camps. Over the years, multiple store owners and their families were killed during robberies or in disputes over money. The details of these crimes, brutal and seemingly senseless, spread through the region and gave Ruby a sinister reputation. When the mine finally shut down in the 1940s, the town emptied quickly. Nobody wanted to stay in a place associated with so much violence, especially once the jobs were gone. What makes Ruby distinctive as a ghost town today is how well preserved it remains. Many of the original buildings still stand, including the schoolhouse with its desks still arranged in rows, the jail with its iron bars rusted but intact, private homes with personal belongings, left behind when people fled. Walking through Ruby is like walking through a moment frozen in time, except that moment is tinged with the knowledge of the violence that occurred there. Tour guides who bring visitors to Ruby always mention the murders, because that's part of the draw. People want to see where bad things happened, want to feel the frisson of danger, even when the danger is decades past. Nelson, Nevada, near the El Dorado Canyon mine, earned its own reputation as a tough, lawless place. Gold, silver, and copper mining in the 1860s attracted fortune seekers from across the country and around the world. When that many people gather in a remote location, with minimal law enforcement and large amounts of valuable ore changing hands, violence inevitably follows. Disputes over mine ownership were common. The Tecate mine, the largest in the area, saw numerous killings over the years as various parties fought for control. The details are murky because record-keeping in frontier mining camps was haphazard at best. But local history is full of stories about murders, claim jumping, and shootouts. Nelson continued operating sporadically into the 1940s, but its best years were long past by then. The town had been dying slowly for decades, and by the time the last mines closed, only a handful of die-hard residents remained. Today, Nelson is popular as a filming location for movies and TV shows that want an authentic Western ghost town setting. The wooden buildings and old mining equipment provide perfect backdrops for stories about the Wild West. But the real stories of Nelson, the ones about men killing each other over money and ore rights, are darker and messier than anything Hollywood typically films. Bannack, Montana, takes the legend of violent frontier justice to another level. Founded in 1862 after gold was discovered in Grasshopper Creek, Bannack quickly grew into one of Montana's largest settlements. It was, by all accounts, a wild place in its early years, with saloons and brothels and the general chaos of a boomtown where nobody was quite sure who had legal authority. The sheriff of Bannack, Henry Plummer, was supposed to be enforcing law and order. But rumors circulated that Plummer was actually the secret leader of a gang of road agents who robbed and killed travelers on the route between Bannack and Virginia City. Whether these rumors were true or whether Plummer was innocent and got scapegoated has been debated by historians ever since. What's undisputed is that Plummer was hanged by a vigilante committee in 1864, along with several other men accused of being part of his gang. The vigilante justice period in Bannack and nearby Virginia City represents a dark moment in Montana history, when extra-legal violence was used to impose order, or at least what the vigilantes considered order. Estimates suggest that the vigilance committees hanged more than 20 men in the space of a few months. Some of those men were probably guilty of serious crimes. Others might have been innocent, killed because they had the wrong associations, or because someone wanted to settle a score. Once vigilante justice starts, it's hard to stop. The same impulse that leads people to take the law into their own hands to catch a killer can just as easily be turned against anyone you don't like. Bannack survived longer than many gold rush towns, with mining operations continuing sporadically into the 1940s and a few residents hanging on into the 1950s. Today it's a state park, with many of the original buildings preserved and interpretive signs explaining the history. Ghost tour companies bring visitors looking for paranormal experiences, because a town with Bannock's violent history is prime territory for ghost stories. Whether the buildings are actually haunted, or whether people's expectations and imaginations create the experiences, doesn't really matter. What matters is that Bannock's history of violence has become part of its identity, inseparable from its story. Frisco, Utah, represents violence on a different scale. At its peak in the 1880s, Frisco had about 6,000 people and a reputation for being one of the wildest towns in the West. The phrase commonly associated with Frisco is "a murder a day," which is probably an exaggeration, but gets at the town's character. Silver mining attracted miners, but it also attracted gamblers, prostitutes, con artists, and criminals of every variety. The number of saloons in Frisco at one point exceeded 20, which for a town of 6,000 suggests that drinking was a primary occupation. Gambling was ubiquitous, and where there's gambling and drinking, fights break out. Some of those fights ended in killings. Frisco's boom was short-lived. A major silver mine collapsed in 1885, killing no miners only because the collapse happened between shifts, but destroying the town's economic foundation. People left almost as fast as they'd arrived. Within a few years, Frisco's population had dropped to a fraction of what it had been. Mining continued at a reduced scale for decades, but the town never recovered its boom-era prosperity or its reputation for violence. Today, Frisco is a genuine ghost town with just a cemetery and a few scattered ruins remaining. The old charcoal kilns, huge beehive-shaped stone structures that were used to convert wood into charcoal for the smelters, still stand as impressive monuments to the industrial scale of the mining operations. But the town itself is gone, and with it went all those murders and fights and chaos. The violence that defined Frisco's identity faded into legend, stories told by historians and tour guides, but no longer part of lived experience. What these stories of violence tell us is that even in the 20th century, even in places that were supposed to be civilized and modern, the collapse of economic prosperity and the breakdown of social structure could lead to dangerous situations. Not all of the violence in dying towns was historical. In Grants, New Mexico, as the uranium boom ended and people became desperate, crime rates increased. When jobs disappear and savings run out, some people turn to theft or worse to survive. The sense of community that had kept these towns safe during the good years frayed under economic pressure. The ghost towns of the American West carry their violent histories with them like a shadow. Tour guides mention the murders because tourists expect it, because violence adds drama to history. But for the people who lived through those times, the violence was real and traumatic. The widow whose husband was killed in a mine dispute or a robbery didn't see it as a colourful story to tell later. She saw it as the end of her world. The violence of ghost towns, both the frontier violence of the 19th century and the desperation-fueled crime of the 20th century, reminds us that these places weren't romantic or noble. They were hard, sometimes cruel places where life was cheap, and death could come suddenly for bad reasons or no reason at all. When walking through ghost towns today, looking at the empty buildings and rusted equipment, it's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine these places as simpler times when life had more meaning and community had more substance. But the violence woven into their histories resists that romanticization. These were not idyllic communities destroyed by outside forces. These were flawed human settlements, marked by greed and conflict and suffering, that happen to also have moments of genuine community and connection. The violence doesn't erase the good parts of their histories, but it makes those histories more complicated and more human. Some ghost towns didn't die because the jobs left or the highway moved. They died because the land itself became poisonous, contaminated by the very industries that had given them life. The toxic legacy of mining turned entire communities into environmental disaster zones that could no longer support human habitation. Picher, Oklahoma, sat at the heart of what was called the Tri-State Mining District, an area spanning Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri that produced vast quantities of lead and zinc for decades. The town was established in 1918 and quickly grew to a peak population of over 14,000 people in the 1920s. The mines went deep underground, creating a warren of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the earth beneath the town. For decades, This was profitable and seemed sustainable. Lead and zinc had steady demand for industrial uses, and the ore deposits were rich enough to support continued extraction. But mining operations inevitably create waste. When you process ore, you're left with tailings, the crushed rock and chemical residue that remains after the valuable minerals have been extracted. At Picher, these tailings were piled into huge mounds around the town, massive hills of crushed rock containing lead, zinc, and other heavy metals. Nobody worried much about this during the mining years. The tailings were just an accepted part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the headframes and the mine buildings. The first serious warnings came in 1972, when contaminated water began seeping from the old mines. The water was acidic and loaded with dissolved metals. It contaminated groundwater, seeped into streams and rivers, and posed obvious health risks. Efforts were made to contain and treat the water, but the scale of the problem was enormous. You can't easily decontaminate hundreds of miles of underground tunnels filled with contaminated water. Worse, the tailings piles weren't inert. Rain would wash heavy metals out of the piles and carry them into the surrounding soil and water. The lead dust from the piles would blow on windy days, settling on houses, yards, playgrounds. Children playing outside were being exposed to lead at levels far exceeding what's considered safe. Blood testing of Picher children revealed horrifying rates of lead poisoning. Lead exposure, especially in children, causes permanent neurological damage, lowering IQ, causing behavioral problems, and leading to a range of health issues that last a lifetime. By 2006, both state and federal environmental agencies had determined that Picher was too contaminated to be safely habitable. The government initiated a buyout program, purchasing homes and businesses from residents who wanted to leave. Many people accepted the buyouts and relocated, but the process was agonizing. The money offered was based on assessed property values, which for houses in a contaminated town were minimal. Families who had owned their homes for generations found themselves getting a few $1,000s for properties they had thought were their nest eggs. Moving meant leaving behind not just houses but memories, community, identity. Where do you go when the place you're from becomes literally toxic? The decision to leave wasn't just difficult emotionally, it was difficult practically. Some residents worried that the buyout money wouldn't be enough to start over somewhere else. Real estate and cost of living in other towns might be higher. Finding comparable housing and employment elsewhere wasn't guaranteed, especially for older residents who weren't in the workforce anymore. But staying meant continued exposure to lead, meant watching your children or grandchildren suffer health effects that could have been prevented. It was a choice between two forms of loss. By 2013, most of Picher had been demolished. Buildings were torn down to prevent them from becoming hazards or attracting trespassers. The elementary school, the high school, the churches, the stores, all of it was reduced to rubble and hauled away. A few structures remained for a while, including the town's mining museum, which was meant to preserve the history of the area. But in 2015 and 2017, suspected arson attacks destroyed the museum and an old church. Whether these fires were set by former residents angry about what had happened to their town, or by vandals or thrill-seekers, the result was the same. Even the last remnants of Picher's physical presence were erased. Gary Lindemann, who owned the Old Miner Pharmacy, was one of the last holdouts. He vowed to stay until the bitter end, maintaining his business even after almost everyone else had left. His defiance was admirable in its way, a refusal to let the contamination win. But it was also futile. Lindemann died in June 2015, and with his death, Picher's population officially reached zero. The tragedy of Picher is that the contamination was preventable. The mining companies knew, or should have known, that lead tailings pose health risks. The technology and knowledge to manage mining waste more safely existed. But containment and remediation cost money, and the companies chose profit over public health. When the mines closed and the companies moved on, they left behind the mess for the community and eventually the government to deal with. The cleanup of Picher, overseen by the Environmental Protection Agency as a Superfund site, has cost hundreds of millions of dollars and will continue for decades more. The landscape remains scarred by the tailings piles, which are too massive to remove entirely. The best that can be done is to cap them with clean soil and vegetation to reduce erosion and dust, but that's a band-aid on a wound that will never fully heal. Centralia, Pennsylvania, offers a different but equally devastating example of environmental contamination making a town unlivable. Centralia had been a modest coal mining town since the mid-1800s. By the 20th century it was a quiet community, not wealthy but stable. Then, in 1962, a routine trash burn at the town dump ignited a vein of coal underground. The fire spread through the network of abandoned coal mines beneath Centralia, and despite numerous attempts to extinguish it, the fire continued burning. At first, residents didn't fully understand the threat. An underground coal fire sounds dramatic, but if it's not immediately visible, how bad can it be? But through the 1970s, the effects became impossible to ignore. Smoke and toxic gases, primarily carbon monoxide, began venting from cracks in the ground. Temperatures in basements and yards rose to dangerous levels. Sinkholes opened up as the burning coal created voids that could swallow cars or buildings. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski fell into a sinkhole that opened beneath him, plunging into a pit filled with toxic fumes and heat. He was pulled out just in time, but the incident became a turning point. If the fire could create sinkholes that could kill children, the town was no longer safe. Congress authorized $42 million in 1983 to relocate Centralia's residents. Most people took the buyouts and left, but a small group of die-hard residents refused. They insisted the danger was overblown, that they'd lived with the fire for years and were fine, that the government was using the fire as an excuse to seize their property. Legal battles dragged on for years. Eventually, in 1992, Pennsylvania used eminent domain to claim all the property in Centralia, condemning the buildings and officially evicting the holdouts. About a dozen people continued living there anyway, squatting in houses they no longer legally owned. It wasn't until 2017 that a settlement was finally reached allowing the remaining residents to live in Centralia until their deaths, after which the properties would revert to the state. Today, Centralia is almost entirely erased. Almost all the buildings have been demolished. The streets remain, with their painted lines fading but still visible, marking paths through empty lots where houses once stood. The most famous remaining feature is a section of Highway 61 that was closed decades ago. The road buckled and cracked from the heat below, and now graffiti covers the surface, turning it into a kind of outdoor art gallery. Visitors come to see the graffiti and to feel the heat still radiating from the ground, to see the wisps of smoke that occasionally vent from cracks. The fire is still burning, and experts estimate it could continue for another 100 years or more. There's simply too much coal underground to burn out quickly. The toxic legacies of Picher and Centralia are different in their specifics, but both illustrate the same fundamental problem. Industrial extraction creates damage that outlasts the industry's profitability. The companies that mined lead and zinc in Picher made their profits and moved on decades before the full extent of the contamination became clear. The coal companies that worked in Centralia extracted their coal and left long before the fire started. But the communities that grew up around those industries are stuck with the consequences forever. You can relocate people, you can demolish buildings, but you can't easily undo environmental damage on the scale these places suffered. And these aren't isolated cases. Across the American West, dozens of mining sites are contaminated with heavy metals, radioactive materials, toxic chemicals. Many of these sites are in rural areas with small populations, places that lack political power to demand comprehensive cleanup. The EPA's Superfund program tries to address the worst cases, but it's chronically underfunded and overwhelmed by the number of sites that need attention. Meanwhile, people continue living in proximity to these hazards, often without full understanding of the risks because information isn't well communicated and testing isn't comprehensive. The ghost towns that died from toxicity represent a particularly cruel form of abandonment. The residents didn't leave because the jobs ended or the highway moved. They left because the very ground beneath their feet became dangerous, because staying meant poisoning themselves and their children. That's a betrayal at a fundamental level, a violation of the basic assumption that the place you live should be safe. And it's a betrayal that was preventable if companies and regulators had prioritized public health over profit. But they didn't, and entire communities paid the price. Walking through abandoned ghost towns today feels like exploring a museum of American hope and failure. The buildings stand as monuments to dreams that didn't work out, to communities that believed in their own permanence and were proven wrong. But these aren't carefully curated museum displays. They're raw and deteriorating, nature reclaiming what people briefly held. Garnet, Montana, stands out for the eerie preservation of its buildings. This gold mining town thrived in the 1890s with over 1,000 residents. Then half the town burned down in 1912. With the gold mostly extracted anyway and rebuilding expensive, people just left. They abandoned their homes so quickly that personal belongings were left behind. Today, you can look through windows into houses and see furniture still arranged, as if the owners just stepped out for a moment and never came back. Clothes hang in closets, dishes sit on shelves, a child's toy lies on a floor. The Montana Bureau of Land Management maintains Garnet as a preserved ghost town, which means the buildings are stabilized but not restored. The goal is arrested decay, keeping things from collapsing completely while allowing visitors to experience the authentic feeling of an abandoned place. Walking through Garnet's empty streets, especially off-season, when no other visitors are around, creates an almost supernatural sense of presence. You expect someone to appear in a doorway, to hear voices from inside the buildings. The silence is so profound that any small sound, a bird landing on a roof, a door creaking in the wind, becomes startling. Body, California, operates on a similar preservation philosophy. This gold rush town exploded in the late 1870s, growing to nearly 10,000 people at its peak. It had all the hallmarks of a major western town: banks, hotels, a red light district, dozens of saloons, churches, schools, a Chinatown with several hundred Chinese residents, newspapers, and a robust mining industry. But the gold didn't last forever, and by the 1940s, Bodie was abandoned. What makes Bodie remarkable is how much has survived. The California State Park system maintains it in a state of arrested decay, the same philosophy as Garnet. Over 200 buildings still stand, making Bodie one of the largest ghost towns in America. Walking into a Bodie building is like stepping back in time. The general store still has canned goods on the shelves, their labels faded but readable. A dusty bottle of whiskey sits on a bar. Furniture fills rooms, as if people just went to bed one night and never woke up. But it's not staged. These are the actual artifacts left behind when people departed. The dry desert air of the high Sierra preserves things that would have rotted away in a more humid climate. Wood doesn't rot much when there's no moisture to feed the decay. Fabric deteriorates slowly. Metal rusts but doesn't disintegrate. The interpretive signs at Bodie tell stories about specific individuals who lived there, turning abstraction into personality. You learn about the prostitute who saved her money and eventually bought a hotel, becoming a respectable businesswoman. The Chinese merchant who supplied goods to the Chinese community and mediated disputes. The miner who died underground in an accident, leaving a widow and 5 children with no income. These individual stories make the ghost town human, remind you that these weren't just buildings but homes, workplaces, centers of life. Rhyolite, Nevada, offers a different aesthetic. This gold rush town boomed in 1905 and busted by 1920, a 15-year flash of prosperity that left impressive ruins. Unlike the wooden buildings of Bodie or Garnet, Rhyolite had stone and concrete structures, ambitious buildings designed to last, because the town's founders believed Rhyolite would be a permanent major city. The train depot still stands, a beautiful stone structure with elegant lines. The remains of the 3-story bank building look like something from a Roman ruin, walls standing without roof or floors. And most famously, there's the Bottle House, a structure built with thousands of glass bottles embedded in concrete, creating a kind of mosaic effect. Rhyolite sits in the desert near Death Valley, surrounded by barren mountains and scrubland. The isolation makes it feel even more ghostly. You're miles from the nearest occupied town, in a landscape that's hostile to human life without modern infrastructure. The fact that anyone thought they could build a major city here seems absurd in retrospect, but during a gold rush, optimism overwhelms practicality. If there's gold, people will come. If people come, you build a city. That the city fails when the gold runs out is someone else's problem, someone else's future. Across the American West, similar scenes repeat. St. Elmo, Colorado, at 10,000 feet elevation, has over 24 buildings still standing, including a general store that occasionally opens during summer months. South Pass City, Wyoming, is maintained as a state historic site with 24 buildings and over 30 period exhibits. Bannack, Montana, where we discussed the violence earlier, has over 60 structures preserved. These preserved ghost towns serve multiple purposes. They're tourist attractions, bringing revenue to surrounding communities. They're educational sites, teaching visitors about Western history in a tangible way that you can't get from books. And they're monuments to impermanence, reminders that communities we think will last forever can vanish in a generation. But not all ghost towns are preserved. Many are simply abandoned and left to nature. The weathering patterns in different climates create different aesthetics. In the southwest desert, wooden buildings turn grey and brittle, slowly collapsing as nails rust through and joints separate. Metal roofs warp and perforate. Glass windows break, their shards glittering in the dirt. But the dry air means decay happens slowly. A building might stand, skeletal but recognizable, for a century after abandonment. In more humid climates, the decay is faster and more complete. A wooden building in the mountains of Colorado or Montana will rot within decades if not maintained. The roof will fail first, letting rain and snow in. Then the floor will go. Within 20 or 30 years, you might have just a foundation and a few upright posts. Within 50 years, even those might be gone, leaving just scattered nails and maybe some glass or ceramic fragments to show that people once lived there. The artifacts found in abandoned buildings tell intimate stories. A family photo album, its pages warped by moisture but images still visible. A diary with entries stopping abruptly, the last words trailing off as if the writer was interrupted. Toys abandoned by children, a doll with painted eyes staring at nothing, a toy truck rusted but still recognizable. These objects resist abstraction. They force you to think about the individuals who owned them, who valued them enough to bring them, but left them behind when leaving became necessary. Modern archaeologists and historians study these artifacts to understand daily life in ways that official records don't capture. A general store's inventory tells you what people consumed. The brands of canned goods, the types of tools, the luxuries versus necessities, all of it reveals economic class and cultural priorities. Personal belongings show how people spent their leisure time, what they considered important enough to own, how they maintained connections to the wider world through magazines and mail-order catalogues. But there's an ethical tension in ghost town tourism and preservation. Are these places educational resources or grave sites? When you walk through someone's abandoned home, looking at their possessions, are you learning or trespassing? The people who left these things behind didn't intend them as museum displays. They left them because moving was expensive and you could only take what would fit in a truck or a train car, and many of these items weren't worth the cost of transport. Or they left them because they hoped to come back someday, that this abandonment was temporary, and when they returned they'd need these things. The ethics get more complicated when you consider that some of these ghost towns aren't as abandoned as they seem. In a few cases, 1 or 2 people still live there, maintaining a house, trying to preserve something. These holdouts complicate the narrative. If someone lives there, is it really a ghost town? And how do you balance their right to privacy and property with tourists' desire to explore? Signs. Warning of trespassing on private property. Many ghost town sites, but they're often ignored. The psychological impact of visiting ghost towns varies. Some people find them peaceful, the silence and emptiness offering escape from the noise of modern life. Others find them depressing, these tangible reminders of failure and loss. Still others find them fascinating in an archaeological way, puzzles to be decoded, evidence to be interpreted. But almost everyone who spends time in ghost towns comes away with some sense of impermanence, awareness that communities and civilizations are more fragile than we like to think. These buildings full of abandoned possessions say something universal about the human condition. We build, we accumulate, we put down roots, and then we leave or die, and eventually everything we made crumbles to dust. The ghost cities of the American West weren't supposed to be ghost cities. They were supposed to be the future. They were built on the promises of prosperity, security, and progress that defined American identity in the 20th century. Work hard, play by the rules, invest in your community, and you'll be taken care of. That contract, implicit in everything these towns represented, turned out to be conditional and temporary. When economic forces shifted, when uranium prices fell, or highways moved, or steel demand dropped, the promises evaporated, and the people who had believed those promises were left to pick up the pieces. What happened to the families who scattered from these dying towns? Some found success elsewhere, adapting to new places and new economies. The younger, more educated, more mobile residents often did okay. They took their skills and found jobs in growing cities. Their children went to college and entered professions that weren't tied to any one place. For them, the ghost town became a chapter in their family history, a story told at reunions about where Grandma and Grandpa lived back when. But for others, the dislocation was catastrophic and permanent. Older workers who had spent decades in a single industry couldn't easily retrain. A 55-year-old uranium miner doesn't become an accountant or a software engineer. The skills that made you valuable in a mine, physical strength, endurance, mechanical aptitude, those skills don't transfer easily to service economy jobs. Some displaced workers found employment in other mining operations or similar industrial work, but often at lower pay or in worse conditions. Others cobbled together multiple part-time jobs, never regaining the stability and income they'd once had. The health consequences lasted longer than the towns themselves. The uranium miners who were exposed to radon and radiation dust for years continued getting sick and dying through the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s. Their widows had to fight for compensation, had to prove that their husbands' cancers were caused by mining rather than smoking or other factors. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act of 1989 eventually provided some financial relief, but the amounts were relatively modest, $50,000 or $100,000 for a death or a terminal illness, which doesn't come close to replacing a lifetime of lost income or compensating for a preventable death. Former residents of ghost towns created communities of memory online. Facebook groups and websites brought together people scattered across the country who had once lived in the same small town. Photos were shared, old ones scanned and posted, showing the towns in their prime. People told stories about teachers, coaches, local characters, events that had been important at the time. These virtual reunions couldn't recreate the physical community, but they preserved something valuable, the knowledge that the towns had existed, that they had mattered, that the lives lived there had meaning. Some ghost town communities organize annual reunions where former residents gather, usually in a nearby city since the towns themselves are often unlivable or unsafe. These events are bittersweet. There's joy in reconnecting with old friends and neighbors, seeing how children have grown and hearing about grandchildren. But there's also profound sadness because the gathering itself is proof that the community no longer exists in any permanent form. Everyone at the reunion is there because they're from somewhere that isn't anywhere anymore. The lessons of America's ghost towns feel urgently relevant in a time of economic disruption and climate change. How many of today's communities are one factory closure or one environmental disaster away from becoming the next Eagle Mountain or Picher? The boom and bust cycle that defined the western mining towns isn't limited to mining. Any community that depends primarily on a single industry is vulnerable. Auto manufacturing towns in the Midwest face similar collapses when factories closed or moved production overseas. Small farming communities struggle as agriculture consolidates and mechanizes. Coal towns in Appalachia are experiencing the same pattern that uranium towns went through decades earlier, with the added complication that coal's decline is being driven by climate policy rather than just market forces. The ghost towns also raise uncomfortable questions about environmental justice. The communities that got poisoned by lead or radiation or underground coal fires were usually working class, often rural, with limited political power. Would Picher have been allowed to become so contaminated if it had been an affluent suburb? Would anyone have tolerated an underground fire burning for decades beneath a wealthy town the way it was tolerated in Centralia? The people who pay the costs of environmental damage are rarely the same people who reap the profits from the industries that caused the damage. And there's a question about responsibility that remains unresolved. When a mining company extracts value from the land and then leaves contamination behind, who should bear the cost of cleanup? The company argues it operated legally at the time and shouldn't be held responsible for what we now know about environmental damage. The government argues it lacks the funds to clean up every site. The communities argue they shouldn't have to pay for contamination they didn't cause. Meanwhile, the sites remain hazardous, the cleanup inadequate or non-existent, and new generations continue being exposed to risks. Could any of this have been prevented? Possibly. If uranium miners had been given adequate ventilation and protective equipment, most of the cancers could have been avoided. If mining companies had been required to properly manage their waste, Picher might still be habitable. If the interstate highway system had been designed with more consideration for existing communities, some Route 66 towns might have survived by maintaining access. But prevention requires foresight and a willingness to prioritize public good over private profit, and American capitalism hasn't traditionally been structured that way. The incentives favor extraction, growth, and moving on when extraction becomes unprofitable or growth plateaus. The ghost towns of the American West stand as warnings about the fragility of prosperity and the human cost of treating communities as disposable. They're monuments to broken promises, to people who did everything right and still lost everything. They're evidence that the American dream, however appealing its mythology, has always been conditional and contingent, available to some but not others, sustainable for a while but not forever. Driving through the American West today, you'll pass dozens of these places without necessarily recognizing them. A cluster of abandoned buildings visible from the highway might register for a moment before your eyes move on to the next vista. A historical marker might mention a town that used to exist near here, but if you don't stop and read it, you'll never know. The landscape has swallowed most of the evidence, with desert reclaiming what was briefly taken, mountains shrugging off the scars of mines, weather erasing graffiti and collapsing walls. But the stories persist. Every ghost town has witnesses who remember when it was alive, when the streets were busy and the schools were full and Friday nights meant football and community. Those witnesses are aging, and eventually they'll all be gone, taking their memories with them. What remains will be ruins and archives, physical artifacts and historical records, evidence that something was here once but lacking the texture and detail that only living memory provides. The question these ghost towns pose to us is not just about the past, but about the future. What are we building now that will become ruins later? What communities are we creating that depend on industries or resources that won't last? What promises are we making that we won't be able to keep? The people of Glenrio, and Leadville and Jeffrey City and Eagle Mountain didn't think their towns would become ghosts. They thought they were building something permanent. They were wrong, not because they failed, but because the economic and political systems they existed within were never designed for permanence, only for extraction and growth until extraction becomes unprofitable and growth stalls. The ghost cities of the American West are not just history, they're prophecy. They tell us what happens when communities are treated as means rather than ends, when people's lives and livelihoods are considered acceptable losses in pursuit of larger economic goals. They show us the aftermath of boom without planning for bust, of extraction without responsibility for remediation, of progress that leaves devastation in its wake. And they remind us that memory matters. The effort to preserve these towns, to maintain them as historical sites, to document their stories and share them, that effort keeps faith with the people who lived there. It says their lives had meaning, their communities had value, their losses deserve acknowledgement. The ghost towns are graveyards, but they're also archives, and in walking through them, in learning their histories, we honor the people who briefly made these places home. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about Glenrio and its abandoned Texaco station. Think about Sarah Mitchell watching the traffic pass on the new interstate, knowing her town was dying. Think about the uranium miners in Jeffrey City, breathing dust that would kill them decades later. Think about the children of Picher, playing in contaminated yards while their parents had no idea of the danger. Think about the last residents of Eagle Mountain, refusing to leave even when leaving was the only rational choice. Think about all the people who built lives in places that ceased to exist, who believed in promises that proved empty, who did everything right and still lost everything. Their stories are American stories, as much a part of our history as the successful cities and thriving towns. The ghost towns of the American West are not aberrations or exceptions. They're part of the pattern, the other side of the boom, the price of progress. And if we don't learn their lessons, if we don't understand how communities become ghosts and people become refugees in their own country, we're doomed to keep creating more of them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through America's forgotten places. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to support the channel. And in the comments, let me know. Have you visited any ghost towns? Do you have family connections to places that no longer exist? What ghost town stories should we explore next? Your engagement keeps these forgotten histories alive. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, the places we build today might be the ruins someone explores tomorrow. Make sure the story they tell is one we can be proud of